Summer 1965. At 20,000 feet above North Vietnam, the sky became the deadliest battleground in modern aerial warfare history. This zone was known as MiG Alley, a killing field where the best American and North Vietnamese pilots faced each other in aerial duels that determined life and death in split seconds. Up here, there were no second chances. No time for hesitation. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and you were gone. Shot down, captured, or worse, your aircraft disintegrating around you as cannon shells tore through aluminum and steel at supersonic speeds. This wasn't just a war of technology. This was a battle of courage, strategy, nerves of steel, and the absolute will to survive in the most dangerous place on Earth. Jets screaming at 600 miles per hour. Missiles streaking through the air. The constant threat of surface-to-air missiles rising from below. And always, the fear of seeing that enemy fighter appear in your 6 o'clock position, right on your tail with guns blazing. This is the true story of MiG Alley, the battle for North Vietnam's skies. A story of bravery, sacrifice, and the young men who fought and died in the thin air above a war-torn nation. To understand MiG Alley, we must go back to the early 1960s. The Vietnam War wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a proxy battlefield between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each side determined to prove the superiority of their ideology, their technology, and their way of war. By 1964, the situation in South Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. The Viet Cong insurgency was gaining ground. The government in Saigon was unstable. President Lyndon Johnson faced a critical decision: escalate American involvement or risk losing South Vietnam to communism. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965. This wasn't just another bombing campaign. It was the most sustained aerial offensive since World War II. The objective: destroy North Vietnam's industrial capacity, disrupt supply lines to the south, and force Hanoi to the negotiating table through overwhelming air power. American planners believed it would take weeks, maybe months at most. They were catastrophically wrong. North Vietnam, backed by massive Soviet and Chinese military aid, built the most sophisticated and deadly air defense system ever seen outside of Europe. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns ringed every major city and strategic target. SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, the same type that had shot down Gary Power's U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union, formed an impenetrable umbrella over Hanoi and Haiphong. Radar stations tracked every American aircraft from the moment they crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. And at the heart of this integrated defense system were squadrons of MiG fighters, agile, deadly, and piloted by aviators who had been handpicked and trained by the finest Soviet instructors at bases in the USSR and China. These weren't farmers in flying suits. These were professional warriors, taught the same tactics that Soviet pilots would use to defend Moscow in the event of World War II. The airspace around Hanoi, Haiphong, and along the corridors to strategic targets became the most contested aerial real estate on the planet. Every day, American strike packages, sometimes 100 aircraft or more, would fight their way through this gauntlet. And every day, MiG fighters would rise to meet them, American pilots, many of them veterans who had flown in Korea, began calling this zone MiG Alley, recalling a similar area along the Yalu River where American and Soviet pilots had battled a decade earlier. But this MiG Alley was different. More dangerous, more deadly. The stakes were higher, the technology more advanced, and the combat more intense than anything aviation had seen before or since. On the American side, 2 aircraft became the backbone of air operations over North Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom II and the F-105 Thunderchief. Each was a masterpiece of engineering. Each had critical flaws that would cost lives. The F-4 Phantom II, designed by McDonnell Douglas as the ultimate interceptor. This twin-engine monster could carry more ordnance than a World War II B-17 bomber. Maximum speed, Mach 2.2, over 1,600 miles per hour. It could climb to 40,000 feet in under 2 minutes. Range, over 1,000 miles with external fuel tanks. The Phantom was armed with the most advanced missiles in the world. The AM-7 Sparrow, a radar-guided missile that could kill targets 20 miles away, far beyond visual range. The AIM-9 Sidewinder, a heat-seeking missile that could track and destroy any aircraft that showed an infrared signature. With these weapons, American planners believed dogfights were obsolete. Future air combat would be fought at long range, with radar and missiles, never seeing your opponent. But there was one fatal flaw in this thinking. One critical oversight that would haunt American pilots throughout the war. The early F-4 Phantom had no internal gun. No cannon, no bullets. The designers believed missiles alone would be sufficient. After all, why would a supersonic jet ever need to engage in close-range combat? That was thinking from World War II, from Korea. This was the missile age. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. The F-105 Thunderchief, nicknamed the Thud by its pilots, was the largest and heaviest single-seat fighter ever built. 50 feet long, weighing over 50,000 pounds fully loaded. This beast was designed for one mission: penetrate enemy defenses at low level at high speed and deliver nuclear or conventional bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The Thud could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs internally, plus another 6,000 pounds on external pylons. It was fast, Mach 2.0 at altitude, and it was tough. The fuselage was designed to withstand tremendous battle damage. Many Thuds limped home with massive holes torn in their wings and fuselage by anti-aircraft fire. But the F-105 was not a dogfighter. It was heavy, built for speed and weapons delivery, not maneuverability. In a turning fight with a nimble MiG, the Thud was at a severe disadvantage. Yet every day, F-105s had to fight their way through MiG Alley to reach their targets deep in North Vietnam. Many never made it home. American pilots were the best trained aviators in the world. Many were graduates of the Navy's Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun. They had hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours of flight time. They flew the most advanced aircraft on the planet. They had confidence, perhaps too much confidence, in their technology and their training. But they were about to learn a harsh lesson, one that would be written in blood across the skies of North Vietnam. Interview, F-4 Phantom veteran pilot, dramatized.
We thought this would be easy. I mean, we had everything, right? We had radar that could see for 50 miles. We had missiles that could kill from 20 miles away. We had speed. We had power. We had the best training in the world. The MiG-17 was a Korean War relic, subsonic, old technology, outclassed in every measurable way. But then you get up there. You're cruising at 25,000 feet. Your radar warning receiver starts screaming. Sam's launching. You're dodging missiles. You're weaving. You're dropping chaff. And suddenly, out of nowhere, out of the sun, you've got a MiG-17 on your tail. 3 seconds ago, your radar showed nothing. Now he's firing cannons and you're pulling HGs trying to shake him. All that technology doesn't mean a damn thing when you've got tracers going past your canopy. That's when you learn that aerial combat hasn't changed as much as we thought. It's still about situational awareness, aggressive tactics, and who has the balls to get in close and take the shot.
In 1964, North Vietnam's Air Force barely existed. A handful of ancient propeller aircraft, a few pilots with minimal training, no infrastructure, no doctrine, no capability to challenge American air superiority. 18 months later, they had become one of the most dangerous air forces on the planet. This transformation was made possible by massive Soviet and Chinese assistance. Hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid. Advanced aircraft delivered by ship and rail. Most critically, expert training provided by battle-tested Soviet instructors. The MiG-17 Fresco, NATO code name for a fighter that had first flown in 1950. By American standards, this was ancient technology. Subsonic, no radar, no missiles, just 3 cannons, 1 powerful 37mm cannon and 2 rapid-fire 23mm guns. But in the hands of a skilled pilot, the MiG-17 was lethal. Its turning radius was incredibly tight, far better than any American fighter. Below 10,000 feet in a dogfight, a MiG-17 could outturn an F-4 Phantom with ease. And those cannons, when they hit, they destroyed. A burst of 37mm shells could tear the wing off a fighter or blow apart an engine. There was no surviving a direct hit from a MiG-17's guns. The MiG-21 Fishbed, a delta-winged supersonic interceptor that represented the cutting edge of Soviet aviation technology. Mach 2.0 capability, small, nimble, incredibly fast in the climb, armed with heat-seeking atoll missiles, copies of the American Sidewinder, and a twin-barrel GSH-23 23mm cannon. The MiG-21 was designed for one specific mission: high-speed hit-and-run attacks. Climb rapidly to intercept altitude. Use ground-controlled radar guidance to position for attack. Make one high-speed pass. Fire missiles. Escape before the enemy can react. This was classic Soviet doctrine, developed during the Cold War to counter American bomber formations threatening the USSR. But what truly made North Vietnam dangerous was not just the aircraft, it was the system. The North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors created an integrated air defense network that was years ahead of anything the Americans had faced before. Radar stations, scattered across the country, tracked every American aircraft from the moment it crossed the border. These radars fed information to centralized command posts, where controllers could vector MiGs to optimal intercept positions. Surface-to-air missile sites surrounded every major target. Anti-aircraft artillery, hundreds of guns, from 23mm up to massive 100mm weapons, created a curtain of steel through which aircraft had to fly. Everything worked together. If MiGs forced American fighters to descend, they flew into the anti-aircraft fire. If fighters climbed to avoid the flak, MiGs attacked from above. If they tried to evade both, SAM missiles rose to meet them. It was a deadly chess game, and the North Vietnamese were becoming masters at playing it. Vietnamese pilots were selected with extraordinary care. Intelligence officers identified candidates with quick reflexes, excellent eyesight, strong nerves, and, crucially, absolute political reliability. The chosen few were sent to the Soviet Union and China for training. At Soviet bases, Vietnamese pilots learned the same air combat tactics that would be used to defend Moscow in World War II. They flew against experienced Soviet instructors who had studied American tactics extensively. They practiced intercepts, gunnery, missile employment, and escape maneuvers until every action became instinctive. But Vietnamese pilots also adapted Soviet doctrine to their unique situation. They developed tactics that played to their strengths and exploited American weaknesses. They used the weather, clouds and monsoon storms, to mask their approach. They timed their attacks to coincide with SAM launches, adding to American confusion. They targeted vulnerable aircraft, the bomb-laden F-105s, rather than engaging in prolonged dogfights with F-4 escorts. Most importantly, they understood something that gave them a psychological advantage. They were defending their homeland. Every mission was flown over familiar territory. If shot down, they landed among friends. American pilots, conversely, knew that ejection meant capture, imprisonment, possibly torture. Quote from Vietnamese pilot memoir, dramatized.
We knew the odds. We knew the Americans had 10 times more aircraft, better technology, pilots with more training hours than we could ever achieve. We knew that statistically most of us would not survive the war, but we also knew something they didn't. We were fighting for our homes, our families, our nation's independence. Every time I climbed into that MiG cockpit, I wasn't just a fighter pilot. I was a defender of my people. That gave us courage to take risks that American pilots, flying thousands of miles from home, could never take. We would fly directly at their formations when they outnumbered us 5-1. We would stay in the fight when our fuel was critically low, when our aircraft were damaged, when every survival instinct screamed to run, because this was our sky, our country, and we would defend it with our lives if necessary.
April 3, 1965, a date that would be remembered in aviation history. The day North Vietnamese MiGs drew first blood, the mission seemed routine, or as routine as any combat mission can be. A formation of F-105 Thunderchiefs from the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing, based at Korat Air Base in Thailand, were tasked with destroying the Thanh Hoa Bridge. This bridge, which Vietnamese called the Ham Rong Bridge, was a critical transportation link. American intelligence designated it as a priority target. Pilots nicknamed it Dragon's Jaw, a name that would become infamous as one of the most heavily defended and hardest to destroy targets in the entire war. The strike package was substantial. 8 F-105s loaded with bombs, escorted by F-100 Super Sabres flying combat air patrol. Additionally, 4 F-8 Crusaders from the USS Hancock provided top cover. In total, over a dozen American fighters were in the area. It should have been overwhelming force. The weather that afternoon was typical for the region. Scattered clouds, good visibility, light winds. Perfect flying weather. Perfect conditions for both attackers and defenders. At 2:35 p.m. local time, American surveillance radar detected unidentified contacts, bogies, approaching rapidly from the direction of Hanoi. The radar operators assumed these might be more American aircraft. North Vietnamese MiGs had been spotted before, but they had never attacked. Intelligence assessments suggested the Vietnamese pilots were too inexperienced, too poorly trained to pose a serious threat. That assessment was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. 4 MiG-17s from North Vietnam's 921st Fighter Regiment had scrambled from Noi Bai Air Base minutes earlier. They had been guided by ground controllers to an optimal intercept position. Now they dove toward the American formation. The lead MiG pilot was Pham Nguyen, 24 years old, recently returned from advanced training in China. He had logged less than 200 hours in the MiG-17. By American standards, he was barely qualified. But he had been trained specifically for this moment. Lan selected his target, an F-8 Crusader flying top cover, separated slightly from the main formation. He maneuvered his MiG-17 into firing position, closed to within 1,000 feet, point-blank range in aerial combat, and fired a burst from his 37mm cannon. The shells struck the Crusader's fuselage and wing root. Critical damage. The F-8, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Spence Thomas, immediately began losing control. Hydraulic fluid streaming from shattered lines. Control surfaces not responding. Fire warning lights illuminating across the instrument panel. Thomas had seconds to make a decision. Stay with the aircraft and try to nurse it back to the carrier, or eject now while he still had altitude and airspeed. The choice was made for him. The Crusader's nose dropped sharply. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable dive. Thomas pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew away. The rocket-powered seat blasted him clear of the dying aircraft. Below, Vietnamese militia were already moving toward his parachute's projected landing point. Within minutes of hitting the ground, Thomas was captured. He would spend the next 8 years as a prisoner of war. The remaining MiGs made one more pass, fired at other aircraft without scoring hits, then dove for the deck and escaped before American fighters could react. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. For North Vietnam, this was a tremendous psychological victory. Their Air Force had met the Americans in combat and drawn first blood. One of America's premier fighters had been shot down. The pilot was captured, and the MiGs had escaped without loss. For the United States, April 3rd was a wake-up call. Intelligence estimates had to be revised. North Vietnamese pilots were not the inexperienced farm boys that reports had suggested. They were trained, aggressive, and willing to take significant risks. The skies over North Vietnam would not be uncontested. Within days, American tactics began to change. More fighters were assigned to escort duty. Combat air patrol patterns were adjusted. Rules of engagement were reviewed and modified. But these changes came too late for Spence Thomas. Audio reconstructed radio recording.
Blue Flight, this is Red Leader. We have MiGs inbound. 2 o'clock, hi Roger, Red Leader. I've got visual on MiG. MiG 2 o'clock. Break right. Break right. I'm hit. I've got fire warnings. Losing control. Eject. Get out now.
The chaos in those radio transmissions captured the shock and confusion of that first engagement. American pilots had not expected aggressive, coordinated tactics from Vietnamese fighters. After the initial engagements, both sides entered a period of rapid learning and adaptation. Aerial combat became a deadly classroom where lessons were taught in blood. North Vietnamese tactics evolved quickly, following proven Soviet doctrine but adapting to local conditions. Their approach became known as hit and run, though this simple name belied its sophistication. Vietnamese pilots rarely sought extended dogfights. Instead, they used ground-based radar controllers to guide them to optimal attack positions. These controllers could see the entire battle space: American strike packages, escort fighters, supporting aircraft. They would vector MiGs to approach from the sun or from cloud cover, maximizing surprise. The MiGs would then execute high-speed slashing attacks. One pass, maybe two. Fire cannons or missiles at the most vulnerable targets, usually the bomb-laden F-105s. then dive away at maximum speed before American escorts could respond. The goal wasn't to win dogfights. It was to disrupt the strike package, force bombers to jettison their weapons early, create chaos that would degrade bombing accuracy. The MiG-17, despite being subsonic and technologically inferior, proved remarkably effective in this role. Its small size made it difficult to spot visually. Its tight turning radius meant that if an American fighter did engage, the MiG could often turn inside the larger, heavier F-4 or F-105. Below 5,000 feet in a slow-speed turning fight, the MiG-17 was nearly unbeatable. Vietnamese pilots also exploited American rules of engagement. U.S. fighters were required to visually identify targets before firing. This was a political decision, designed to prevent accidental shoot-downs of friendly or neutral aircraft. But it negated America's primary advantage, long-range radar-guided missiles. F-4 crews couldn't fire Sparrows at distant radar contacts. They had to close to visual range, typically 2 to 3 miles, to identify their target. By then, the MiGs had already set up their attacks. American forces responded with new tactics and formations. The Fluid Four became standard, 2 pairs of fighters, each pair consisting of a leader and wingman, with the pairs mutually supporting each other. Leaders engaged targets while wingmen covered their tails, watching for threats. When one pair was engaged, the other maneuvered to attack the enemy from a different angle. Escort fighters began flying at different altitudes, creating layered defense. High-altitude combat air patrol could spot MiGs approaching from above. Mid-altitude escorts stayed close to the strike package. Low-altitude fighters could intercept MiGs attempting diving attacks. New weapons were rushed into service. The F-4E model finally included an internal 20mm cannon, giving Phantom crews a close-range weapon when missiles failed, or rules of engagement prevented missile employment. Improved versions of the Sidewinder missile, the AIM-9D and later AIM-9E, had better reliability and could lock onto targets from wider angles. But perhaps the most significant American adaptation was in training. It became clear that peacetime training, focused on intercepting Soviet bombers, was inadequate preparation for dogfighting agile fighters. The Navy established the Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, in 1969. The Air Force created Red Flag exercises. Both programs emphasized realistic air combat training against instructors flying aircraft that simulated enemy tactics. The sky above North Vietnam had become a laboratory for modern aerial combat, and both sides were learning fast. In the chaos and carnage of MiG Alley, several pilots emerged as aces, aviators who achieved 5 or more aerial victories. These men became legends, their names known to every fighter pilot who came after. Captain Steve Ritchie, the only U.S. Air Force pilot to achieve ace status in Vietnam. 5 confirmed kills, all while flying the F-4 Phantom. All kills achieved using missiles, never guns. Ritchie was the antithesis of the traditional ace. He wasn't a natural stick-and-rudder pilot, pulling impossible maneuvers and turning dogfights. Instead, he was a technician, a tactician who mastered the complex systems of the F-4 Phantom. He understood radar operation better than most radar operators. He knew every nuance of the AIM-7 Sparrow missile's capabilities and limitations. Ritchie's approach was methodical, used the Phantom's superior radar to detect MiGs at long range, position for attack while beyond visual range, used the Sparrow's radar guidance to kill targets before they knew they were being hunted. It was efficient, clinical, and devastatingly effective. His 5th and final kill came on August 28, 1972. Flying with his regular weapons systems operator, Captain Chuck de Bellevue, Ritchie detected a pair of MiG-21s at 25 miles range. He maneuvered into a favorable position, achieved radar lock, and fired 2 Sparrows. 1 MiG evaded. The second took a direct hit and exploded. The enemy pilot never saw what killed him. Ritchie proved that technological superiority, properly employed, could overcome superior maneuverability. His tactics became doctrine, studied and emulated by Air Force fighter pilots for decades afterward. Randy Duke Cunningham and Willie Driscoll, the most famous ace duo of the Vietnam War. Navy pilots flying from the USS Constellation. They achieved 5 kills in just 4 months during 1972. Cunningham and Driscoll were the opposite of Ritchie in style. They were aggressive, almost reckless in their willingness to engage. They sought out dogfights. They pushed their F-4 to its limits and beyond. Several times they returned to the carrier with their aircraft severely damaged, fuel critically low, having survived encounters that should have killed them. Their tactics emphasized using the F-4's superior power and energy management. They would engage at high speed, use vertical maneuvers to control the fight, and employ the Sidewinder missile when their opponents became predictable. Cunningham was known for his ability to read an enemy pilot's intentions, to anticipate the next move and counter it before it happened, but their most famous engagement, their fifth kill, nearly killed them both. On May 10, 1972, they encountered a MiG-17 piloted by a North Vietnamese ace. The ensuing dogfight became legendary, a classic turning fight that started at 20,000 feet and ended at treetop level. Both pilots used every trick they knew. Rolling scissors, vertical displacement rolls, high G turns that grayed out both pilots' vision. Finally, Cunningham managed to force the MiG into a predictable flight path. A Sidewinder missile tracked true and scored a direct hit. The MiG exploded. Cunningham and Driscoll were aces, but their triumph was short-lived. Minutes later, while aggressing the target area, their F-4 was hit by a surface-to-air missile. The aircraft caught fire. Both men ejected over the Gulf of Tonkin and were rescued by helicopter. They had survived, but their aircraft was gone. Dramatized interview from Cunningham.
People ask me about that last dogfight, the one with the Vietnamese ace. Was I scared? Hell yes, I was scared. This guy was good. Better than good. Every move I made, he countered. Every advantage I gained, he negated. We're pulling 8, 9 Gs. My vision's tunneling. I can barely move the stick because of the G-forces. And this guy in his little MiG-17, he's right there with me. Turn for turn. Move for move. At one point we're in a vertical climb. Both of us bleeding energy. Both about to stall. I'm thinking if we both stall, we're going to auger straight into the ground. But neither of us is backing down. This is what it's about. This is why we fly fighters. Finally, I get him into a position where he's predictable. Just for 2 seconds. That's all I needed. Sidewinder came off the rail, guided perfectly, hit him square. But even then, even as his aircraft was breaking apart, I felt, I don't know, respect. This guy almost beat me. In an inferior aircraft, he almost won. That's the thing people don't understand about aerial combat. It's not just about the machine. It's about the man. And that Vietnamese pilot? He was one hell of a fighter pilot.
On the North Vietnamese side, several pilots achieved ace status and became national heroes. Their stories were told and retold, inspiring new generations of pilots. Even today, decades after the war, they are revered. Nguyen Van Coc, officially credited with 9 confirmed aerial victories, though some Vietnamese sources claim he achieved 13 kills. Vietnam's leading ace, a master of the MiG-21 and the hit-and-run tactics that made the aircraft so deadly. Van Coc's approach was calculated and patient. He would wait for ground controllers to position him perfectly. He would use clouds or the sun to mask his approach. Then, at the last possible moment, he would accelerate to maximum speed, fire his missiles from optimal range, and dive away before American escorts could react. His signature tactic became known among American pilots, the cock pop. He would approach from directly astern and below, in the F-4's radar blind spot. The first warning American pilots had was the missile launch warning or the flash of cannon fire. By the time they reacted, Van Coc was already diving away at 600 knots. He survived the entire war, rising to the rank of lieutenant general in the Vietnamese People's Air Force. In interviews decades later, he emphasized that his success came not from individual heroics, but from the coordinated system, radar controllers, maintenance crews, intelligence officers all working together. Pham Tuan, credited with 8 confirmed kills. He later became famous as Asia's first cosmonaut, flying to the Soviet space station Salyut 6 in 1980. But during the war, he was known as one of the most aggressive and fearless pilots in the Vietnamese inventory. Pham Tuan's tactics were the opposite of Van Coc's calculated approach. Tuan believed in shock and disruption. He would often fly directly at American formations head-on, firing cannons, forcing the formations to break apart. This wasn't about achieving kills, it was about preventing American bombers from hitting their targets. On multiple occasions, Tuan continued attacking even when his aircraft was damaged, his fuel critically low, or when he was outnumbered 10-1. He once rammed his MiG-21 into the tail of an F-4 Phantom when his ammunition was exhausted, destroying both aircraft. He ejected and survived. Nguyen Van Coc, his name means 7 in Vietnamese, and appropriately, he was credited with 7 confirmed kills. A specialist in the MiG-17, he was considered the finest dogfighter in the Vietnamese People's Air Force. Van Coc's specialty was the slow-speed turning fight. He understood that in this regime, the old MiG-17 could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. He would deliberately force fights into slow, turning engagements where American speed and missile advantages became irrelevant. American pilots who survived encounters with Van Coc described him as uncanny in his ability to predict their moves. In one famous engagement, he fought 4 F-4 Phantoms simultaneously, damaging 2 before escaping. The American pilots involved submitted reports praising their opponent's skill. Dramatized quote from Nguyen Van Coc interview.
Every time we walked to our aircraft, we knew the odds. The Americans had perhaps 500 fighters available. We had perhaps 40 serviceable MiGs on any given day. They could afford to lose aircraft. Every loss for us was catastrophic. They had pilots with 1,000 hours of flight time. Many of us had less than 200 hours when we entered combat. They had radar, advanced missiles, electronic warfare equipment. We had cannons and basic radio, but we had advantages they could not understand. We were fighting over our homeland. Every landmark below was familiar. If we were shot down, we landed among our people. American pilots landed among their enemies. More than that, we had motivation that transcended personal survival. I was not just Nguyen Van Coc, fighter pilot. I was a defender of Vietnam's independence. My family, my village, my nation depended on me and my fellow pilots to defend the sky. This is why we took risks that seemed insane to American pilots. Why we would engage when outnumbered 5-1. Why we would continue fighting when our aircraft were damaged and our fuel almost exhausted. This was our sky, our country, and we would defend it regardless of cost. I remember one mission vividly. I had already shot down 1 F-4. My fuel was very low. Ground control was ordering me to return to base. But I saw another formation of American bombers approaching Hanoi. My family lived in Hanoi. I made one more attack. Shot down a second F-4. By the time I turned for base, my fuel gauge read almost 0. I knew I might not make it. I prepared myself for ejection. The engine quit 5 kilometers from the runway. I glided, no power, just the wind whizzing through the cockpit. I thought, this is how it ends. But I made it. Landed dead stick on the runway. Climbed out of the cockpit. And all I could think was, 2 American fighters down. To fewer aircraft to bomb my city. It was worth the risk. That was how we fought. Every sortie might be our last. But if we could stop one more bombing raid, protect one more target, shoot down one more aircraft, it was worth it. This is why we survived. This is why we won.
By late 1966, American fighter pilots were frustrated. North Vietnamese MiG-21s were becoming increasingly aggressive, inflicting losses on strike packages while avoiding decisive combat with U.S. fighters. The MiGs would hit and run, then retreat to sanctuary airfields that were politically off-limits to American attack. The rules of engagement hampered aggressive tactics. The need for visual identification meant F-4 Phantoms couldn't use their long-range missiles effectively. Meanwhile, MiG-21s were free to attack at will, then escape before American fighters could engage. One man decided to change the equation. Colonel Robin Olds, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. Olds was a World War II ace with 12 confirmed kills against German aircraft. He was aggressive, innovative, and utterly contemptuous of timid tactics. Olds conceived a plan brilliant in its simplicity, used deception to lure MiGs into a trap. He would disguise F-4 Phantom fighters as F-105 Thunderchief bombers. The MiGs would scramble to attack what they thought were vulnerable bomb-laden thuds. Instead, they would find themselves in a furball with America's best fighter pilots flying America's premier air superiority fighter. The plan required meticulous attention to detail. F-4 formations would fly the exact same routes, At the same altitudes, at the same speeds as typical F-105 strike packages, they would use the same radio call signs. They would carry the same external fuel tanks and electronic countermeasure pods that F-105s carried. From North Vietnamese radar screens, the formations would be indistinguishable from routine bombing missions. Olds handpicked his pilots. He wanted the most aggressive, the most experienced, the best marksmen. He briefed them personally, emphasizing that this was their chance to turn the tables on the MiGs. For once, they would have the advantage of surprise. January 2nd, 1967. The weather was terrible, exactly what Olds wanted. Heavy clouds blanketed the region. Visibility was poor. North Vietnamese controllers would be relying on radar, unable to visually confirm what type of aircraft they were tracking at the designated time. 7 flights of F-4 Phantoms, 56 aircraft in total, crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. They flew in typical F-105 formations. Their electronic signatures matched previous strike packages. To North Vietnamese air defense. This appeared to be another bombing raid targeting the Hanoi area. The trap was set. North Vietnamese controllers ordered MiG-21s to scramble from Phuc Yen and Gia Lam airfields. Perhaps 16 to 20 MiG-21s took off, climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. They were expecting to bounce F-105s, struggling under heavy bomb loads. Easy targets. Quick kills. What happened next became the most successful single air combat engagement of the Vietnam War. Colonel Olds himself led the first engagement. His radar operator detected MiG-21s at 15 miles. Olds maneuvered his flight into attack position. The MiGs were still climbing, unaware they were flying into an ambush. At 6 miles, Olds achieved radar lock. He fired 2 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. One malfunctioned, a common problem with early Sparrows. The second guided perfectly. The lead MiG-21, still climbing, took a direct hit and exploded. First blood to Olds, but the battle was just beginning. The surviving MiGs realized too late that they had been deceived. They were engaged not by F-105 bombers but by F-4 Phantom fighters. Worse, they were heavily outnumbered and had climbed into the middle of the American formation. Chaos erupted. The skies filled with aircraft twisting, turning, climbing, diving through the clouds. Missiles streaked through the air. Gun camera footage shows MiGs desperately trying to evade, American fighters in hot pursuit. Captain John Stone fired a sidewinder at a MiG-21, attempting to escape. The missile tracked true, detonating just behind the MiG's engine. The aircraft disintegrated. Major Phil Combis engaged a MiG-21 in a turning fight. The Vietnamese pilot was skilled, forcing Combis to pull maximum Gs. But the F-4's superior power eventually gave Combis the angle he needed. Sidewinder away. Another kill. The engagement lasted just 12 minutes. When it was over, 7 MiG-21s had been destroyed. Not a single F-4 had been lost. Not even damaged. Operation Bolo was a catastrophic defeat for North Vietnam. They had lost nearly half their MiG-21 fleet in a single engagement. Worse, they had lost confidence in their tactics and in their ground-controlled intercept system. If American formations could no longer be trusted to be what they appeared, how could interceptors be employed safely? For months afterward, MiG activity dropped dramatically. North Vietnamese pilots became far more cautious. They avoided engagement unless they had overwhelming advantages. The psychological impact of Operation Bolo was even greater than the material losses. Robin Olds, quote, dramatized.
We handed them their asses that day, and I'll tell you why it worked. It wasn't just the deception, though, that was crucial. It was that we went in there with the mindset that we were going to win. We were tired of pussyfooting around with these ridiculous rules of engagement. We were tired of watching MiGs bounce our strike packages and then run away. So we took the fight to them, on our terms, with our rules, and we destroyed them. That's the lesson of Bolo. Aggression wins. Innovation wins. Being willing to take calculated risks wins. Sitting back and playing defense, that's how you lose pilots and aircraft and wars. I just wish we'd been allowed to follow up, hit those airfields while the MiGs were grounded and disorganized. But no, political considerations. Always political considerations. So they rebuilt, retrained, and came back. But for those few months, we owned the sky.